A very warm welcome to all of you here in the audience, live here in the Balie, and a warm welcome to the people watching at home from the live stream. My name is Yoeri Albrecht. I'm director of the Balie, and I will conduct this evening for you. Tonight we have a really important topic, an important topic to everybody, to all of us, the relationship between science and politics. And I think it's safe to say that everybody here lived through the COVID crisis, so I think everybody can sort of relate to the topic as having a direct influence on our lives. So a very warm welcome to our main guest of today, Sir Geoff Mulgan. I'm very happy that he's here. He's going to talk about his latest book. He's an avid writer. I mean, this amazing, prolific writer, actually. His newest book, When Science Meets Power. So he's going to give an introduction to that, and I'm going to give a short, very short introduction to Sir Geoff Mulgan, advisor of the British government, advisor to Tony Blair, to Brown. Actually started out as an advisor to Brown. Then, among many things, director of the strategy unit in Downing Street 10, founder of think tanks, Damas, for instance, president of the Young Foundation, and somebody, I could say, a pioneer to ideas and innovation of public policy and developer of ideas like smart cities or digital democracy, working on those things for decades. I can go on and on and on. I won't. We're going to listen to Geoff Mulgan. I'm very happy that he's here. Also personally, I have to say. Because I don't think we've seen each other for more than 20 years. But when I started out as organizing these sort of evenings, I was one of the editors of the political weekly Vrij Nederland, and we organized Happy Chaos for many times. We started organizing it. Tino Wallard, who is in the audience as well. And we were so excited that we were able to get Geoff Mulgan to talk at our Happy Chaos evenings. Because we read together with a group of younger people involved in public policy and those sort of things, we read Connexity, Responsibility, Freedom, Business and Power in the New Century. This booklet. And I still have it in my room. And Tino brought his one and reread it. That was truly inspiring in the way that you can try to write and say something about how we govern our societies and which sort of powers in it influence each other and how you can go about it. It's a very positive way of thinking about not shaping it, not top down, but seeing what's happening and seeing where it moves and how you can maybe sort of influence those streams. And that's still true, I would say, for this book, When Science Meets Power. I leave it to that. I'll invite you to give a big round of applause to Geoff Mulgan. Very warm welcome to you. Very happy you're here.
Well, thank you all for coming out on a February evening. Thank you to Yoeri. It's great to be here and back in the Balie, which is an institution I'm very envious of. We don't really have anywhere quite like this in London now, strangely. And a place where different ways of seeing and thinking can collide and hopefully produce something new. And thanks to Caroline, who we'll hear from later, who's brought me to Amsterdam on this trip. So I'm going to talk fairly rapidly about some of the themes of this book. As Yoeri said, we've all been living it in a way the last few years through the pandemic, but also through the arguments about climate change and many other things. And I'm a professor in an engineering department which has science in its title. And I thought I'd start by asking you a question. I haven't asked this to any other audience, but let's just see what happens with this one. Does anyone in this room live their life based on science? One person does. Fantastic. Okay. So if you read some science about diet or whatever, you just put it into practice straight away. A little bit. Okay.
I take 5-12 because I eat vegan.
Yeah, okay. I mean, probably all of us do a little bit, but it's always quite hard. And in a way, what I'll be talking about is some of the tensions which also affect governments in this respect. Let's see if I can point this the right way. And I was just saying earlier, I live in a town near London where I would now say a majority of my neighbors are skeptics. They were skeptical of vaccines. A few months ago, I heard some telling me the entire COVID pandemic was a hoax, being invented by the media, the same media which has been responsible for the hoax on climate change. And these patterns of science doubt are deepening, and they are one part of this story, but they're not the main one I want to talk about. The bigger one, in a way, which prompted the book is the recognition that on the agendas of governments and politics all over the world, the proportion of issues which have a big science element has just been going up and going up. So obviously climate, whether mitigation, anticipation, obviously pandemics, but also large language models now and AI, but so many other things like mental health or childhood or aging. And I think this is actually almost a structural change for politics, whereas perhaps a generation or two ago there were issues of science, nuclear power and so on, but they weren't most issues. And I think we still haven't quite come to terms with the implications for politics, both theory and practice, of this shift. And that's what prompted the book. I've worked, let me go back actually. I've worked in my life a lot as a bureaucrat, the UK and Australia, Singapore, quite a few other places, sometimes as an academic, sometimes as an advisor, and often on these boundaries of trying to make laws and rules and programs and trying to think about where we're heading. So you may hear in what I say some of the confusions of being on those boundaries as well as the answers. I worked a little bit with this guy, Peter Gluckman, who was chief scientist for the then Prime Minister of New Zealand, and then chaired the International Network of Government Science Advisors. And he makes what to this group might be an obvious point, that so many problems are now simultaneously scientific and political. And there you can see a list from legalization of drugs to family violence, obesity, suicide, carbon reductions in farming, you name it. More and more things have this dual quality. And what I'll try and say in the next 10 or 15 minutes is what that implies for our political theory and our practice. Now, in the book, I argue we have what I call a science-politics paradox. And the paradox is that when we're faced with a new technology, like maybe very powerful AI, the only way we as a society can shape or direct that technology is ultimately through politics, through laws or regulations and rules. This is how in the past we made the most of things like cars. You know, we brought in a whole array of rules, traffic marking, speed limits, drink-drive rules, emission zones, and so on, so we could get the best of this and not the worst, and those came through governments. But if you look at this chart, which comes from, I think it's 28 countries, you'll see at the top are these highly trusted groups, doctors, scientists, teachers, and so on. And then at the bottom, civil servants, ministers, politicians. And the weird paradox, therefore, is we're expecting these untrusted people to sort of govern the more trusted people in the public interest. And it's kind of fairly obvious that is a bit of a structural problem. And that's part of the explanation of why that bottom group have really struggled on things like AI and many others. Now, the next president of the United States is obviously part of this story, as is his solution for COVID. And in a way, he is a sort of figure of fun for us, but I think it's worth looking at what he represents, because although DeSantis dropped out a few weeks ago, he had decided to outbid Trump on the anti-science flank, to be even more anti-science than Trump. And he was doing so because of this kind of pattern, which we haven't, I think, yet got in Europe, but is a remarkable pattern. This is a poll on basically confidence in science by party voting, where the Republicans actually never all that high. Remember, there's a long tradition of not believing in evolution and so on, but a pretty sharp decline in the last 10 years, and then actually a rise amongst the Democrats. So science has become politically polarized in a way it wasn't. It was opposite, if you see back in the 70s and 80s. And that's leading sort of political entrepreneurs to see new opportunities. But in the book, I point out those are in a way the easier, probably for a group like this, issues where we simply have often rather irrational anti-science skepticism. More tricky is the role of people like Anthony Fauci, who many in Europe saw as a hero. He was the chief scientist in the US when Trump was in office, speaking truth to power. And he had a pretty good pandemic in many ways, but in this testimony to Congress, you see there, this is him trying to explain to Congress why the US public agencies were funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan. That is to say, research to make viruses more dangerous. And he didn't do a very good job of it. And they were pretty skeptical. They thought, in a way, that whole incident, and it's worth watching the video, was a sign of a science elite which had almost slightly lost the plot of how to explain what it was doing, how to make sense of itself to a public, admittedly to congressmen and women who probably didn't have much grounding in science. And that seemed to me a part of a bigger problem. This is the global map of BSL 4 labs. These are biosafety level 4 labs, which you kind of see in Hollywood movies, people full of wearing hazmat suits. And Wuhan was one of these. We now know probably the virus didn't come from that lab, but it could have done. And what's striking is how many of these labs, if you see that list on the left, are in big cities, by people who aren't aware of them at all. And in most of those cases, there are a couple of exceptions. Very little debate about whether it's sensible to have such incredibly risky activity in population centers. And again, that's a symptom of perhaps something slightly awry in the relationship. This, a few weeks ago, was perhaps an even worse example of something awry in the relationship between politics and science. This was at a summit on AI, a summit where you'd have thought the governments of the world were going to think about how to shape, to regulate large language models. And the British Prime Minister interviewed Elon Musk in a kind of deferential way, as the supplicant, as almost the powerless man hoping for a little bit of affirmation from the great technology business leader. And that seemed to me a sort of low point, again, a symptom of something badly wrong in the relationship of science and politics. And we may come on later to what could be happening or should be happening on the governance of AI, which is something I've been quite involved in for about 10 years and still feel we're not getting right at all. And if you look even into the near future, I was in Brussels this morning with a group looking at quantum computing, which maybe how many people in this room could give a 1-minute lecture on quantum computing? 3, okay. Justin Trudeau, when he was Prime Minister of Canada, was asked this question and gave a 3-minute, quite coherent answer. But it's quite hard to... It's inherently difficult to understand. You did mathematics, so you can grasp it. And almost no one knows whether this is the source of a huge surge of economic growth and new businesses and new ways of solving problems, or an incredibly dangerous disruptor of all privacy, all our WhatsApp messages, all Gmail suddenly becoming visible. We don't know, but we don't even have the places to have that discussion at the moment in most countries. So in the book, I look at a lot of history, and I'm not going to go into this at all, some of which is a kind of instrumental history of science and engineering solving problems, being useful. The left is a picture from the incredible story from China 2,500 years ago, where engineers found a way of creating a sort of dam and a flow for the river, which then made Sichuan the richest part of China for 2,000 plus years. On the right is another Elon Musk project done with the Premier of South Australia to build the world's biggest battery to handle electricity outages. And these are where the scientists are solving problems, creating value, being useful. And there are many, many others of that kind. And in their extreme form, they are about war and victory. But the history of all of this, in a way, took a different turn. And this is where I'm just going to give about 30 seconds of theory. In the 17th century, when two very different ideas crystallized. On the right, the ideas which really come from Jean Bodin in France and then Thomas Hobbes in England, of sovereignty, political sovereignty being absolute. Initially it was the sovereignty of the king, but then it became the sovereignty of parliaments, that should stand over everything else. That if you are an elected parliament, you should be able to pass a law on literally anything, from what happens in people's homes to what happens in a lab to anything. And on the left is the symbol of the Royal Society in London, who have this wonderful slogan from the 1660s. How many people in this room speak Latin, I wonder? Does anyone know what that means? Nullius in verba?
Nothing in words?
It's essentially exactly, it means don't believe anyone's word. And in a way, it sums up a scientific principle of doubt, skepticism, which lay right at the beginning of the scientific revolution in the 1660s. And then was part of a whole ethos of science that it should be autonomous, self-referential, peer-reviewed, and free from the inputs and the power of the state, of the Hobbesian sovereign state. And for the last few hundred years, there's been this constant, very complex interaction between these two ideas, sometimes collaborating, as with Oppenheimer, building atomic bombs. At its peak, the size of the entire US auto industry, the Manhattan Project, incredible scale of mobilizing state power with science to achieve an end. And sometimes slightly sort of crazy things. I point out in the book how glory has actually been a very powerful incentive for state involvement in science, even to this day. And many of the space projects around the world, from India to UAE, I think are better understood as about glory than about defense or commerce. But in this story, since the 1940s really, there's been this realization that there were these instrumental things like dams and so on, techne. There was then the episteme, to use Aristotle's language of science. But then we found in the 20th century science generating risks of all kinds, climate, pollution, nuclear, but also crucially, and this was a point of Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, that science itself couldn't explain risk. There could be no scientific theory of risk. Risks come from culture. They come from worldviews. They come from what you value, what you care about, not from the science itself. And so ever since then, there's been this sort of uneasy relationship between all kinds of science activity and risk. And in the book, I turn this into a story which plays on Hegel's account of the dialectic of the master and the servant, which has at least twice been made into great films, but maybe we can come on to that later. And this is it's always a very simple idea, that if you are the master and you have a servant, at first you have all the power, you have all the money, and they serve you. But over time, the servant works on the world, does things, fixes problems, and so on, and actually becomes stronger because of their capability, grows through their interaction with the world, and the master becomes more and more dependent on the servant and the slave. The master becomes paradoxically ever weaker because they are not, as it were, growing in capability. And I argue there's a parallel with the relationship of the state and science, that the state funded science, validated it, gave it status, and so on. But whilst the science world accumulated so many methods and sophistication and disciplines, actually the state and politics hardly advanced at all. It was sort of stuck almost in often quite pre-modern forms. And this then leads to these strange moments, like this one in my country, when the Prime Minister said he was going to follow the science. He's flanked there by the two chief science advisors. And yet he is very much the master and they are the servants, and yet they sit atop huge systems of knowledge generation and synthesis, and he's sort of making it up as he goes along. And really doesn't know how to steer the science. But then they too don't know how to work out, and I'll come to this in a moment, how to make judgments about value, judgments about what matters. So in the book, I argue that one way of thinking about this is to think of three logics at work always in any government dealing with science. The picture in the background, incidentally, is from Bell Labs. It's a picture I love because it was the most creative place in probably the 20th century, and it looks so uncreative. these men looking like bureaucrats. But the three logics are, the logic of science, which is, say, neutral, skeptical, long-term, sees knowledge as a good in itself. Politics, which is very different. It's about stories, it's pragmatic, it's about empathy with people, it's in the present. And then bureaucracy, which is about order, rules and representations. And I argue these are just three different ways of seeing the world, which sometimes overlap and converge, but often clash with each other. And at the moment, my core argument is that we need hybrids. We need new ways of combining the two or three logics to help us navigate these big questions of the next 20, 30 years. Now, some of that is about what I'd call the scientization of politics and government, and this is probably the easier bit. So a lot of my day-to-day work is on very boring stuff, doing evidence synthesis to help make decisions in governments. We created this thing called on health, which governs what can be provided by the health service using detailed open analysis of effectiveness and cost effectiveness. We've now created actually 15 these what work centers, again, using scientific evidence to guide decisions across all of governments. We're seeing also the generalization of the R&D principle. If you're a government, don't introduce your policy on the whole country. Try an experiment first, see if it works. And there are lots of examples from Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for advocating this in development, to things like the Behavioral Insights team, who work in now, I think, about 80 countries, using randomized controlled trials to test out ways of achieving policy goals. Finland, which has an experimental team in its Prime Minister's office. And on the right is something from Canada, where there's been a lot of work on social R&D. Can you use social R&D for things like homelessness and care? So that's sort of scientization, the steady scientization of politics, which is happening quietly and steadily in many parts of the world, a little bit below the radar. Where this gets a little bit more tricky, though, is around the roles of science advice, and we'll hear a bit about this later. So in the traditional model, a science advisor would be an eminent scientist who would then be put inside the office of the Prime Minister or a department and sort of represent the whole of science. Their job was to advise, and the politicians did all the decisions. But this is slightly broken down, I think, this method, and we saw this in the pandemic, where the advisors were de facto making executive decisions. And I think we may need to move towards slightly different models where there's much more systematic orchestration of knowledge input to government using generative AI and networks and collective intelligence, and often more executive roles for the scientists where they become ministers, make decisions, and are held to account, rather than, say, standing back in this traditional model, which dates back to the 17th century, of neutrality and distance and detachment and autonomy. Anyway, we may come onto that. And I think linked to that is the need for what I'd call a politicization of science. And again, this is probably quite controversial. About a year ago, I was part of a project for the UN and others where we looked at all of global science and technology and whether it aligned with the SDGs. And I know there's been some work in the Netherlands, like measuring universities' research linked to SDGs. And here, we found, perhaps not surprisingly, massive misalignment. The world's scientific brain power, there is lots of work on issues on clean energy or health, but it's completely misaligned with what the world has said are its top priorities. And there isn't even a place to have that discussion. In the UN system, there are no places to discuss, is science going in the right ways. It's the 100 billion spent last year on AI research, actually, on the AI research we might want as citizens of the world. And if you're interested, this report has country-level data, looking at pathways in all sorts of fields, but in a way trying to begin a discussion about the global steering of research and innovation for the global goals. And when you look at it, you see how far away we are from that. There's a long tradition of democratic innovation to try and involve the public in these sort of decisions. On the right is a chart from the Danish consensus conferences, which go back, you can see, to the 80s, of trying to get random samples of the public to debate genetics, food irradiation, all these other things. And there are many, many other examples of experiment now with how do you involve the public in a genuine conversation about the choices, the rules, the constraints, and the risks. But I think we're still struggling with getting this right. And in a way, the challenge is how do you do this in ways which really tie in the mass media, so the whole of the public feel they're part of the conversation, not just a handful of experts. And in the book, I talk about what I think is quite a good example from the UK from a long time ago, which is this body. And this came out of a big public debate, a big parliamentary debate on what should be done on things like IVF, cloning, all these other things. And it led to the creation of a powerful public body which could decide. It had no authority, but was also set up with a remit to explain its decisions to the public. On the TV news, why are we allowing stem cells to be used in a certain way, or and so on. And it's been pretty successful. It has achieved that goal of straddling complex science, politics, power, and public legitimation. For me, the remarkable thing is not a single entity like that was created for the internet, when the internet changed all of our lives. Not a single body like that was created for AI, even as AI had already changed all of our lives. And I think there's a sort of series of governance gaps all around us of missing institutions which should have been playing a similar role to the HFEA. Now, I'm just going to end with a couple of points. This play is on actually in London tonight. Many of you have probably seen it. Ibsen's The Enemy of the People. Does anyone remember the story of The Enemy of the People? You'll tell us later. Well, it's a story, it's often presented as a story of science telling truth to power. So he finds an infection in the spa waters of this Norwegian town, and in the play, basically, everyone sort of gangs up on him. The mayor, the editor of the local newspaper, and in the end, the public as well. He becomes the enemy of the people. And this is, say, often presented as almost a paradigmatic play about the scientist hero telling things as it is. But what's really, for me, really interesting about the play is Ibsen thought about it slightly differently. He thought, yes, the scientist is telling truths, but actually the scientist is a bit naive, a bit linear. He has no means of understanding where these people are coming from, why they might fear their livelihood disappearing. And he lacks holistic thinking capability, multi-perspectival thinking. And this is a crucial aspect of this, which I talk about in the book. You don't have to read all of those. There's just a very simple point here. If you were a mayor making decisions in a pandemic, or a prime minister, you have to mobilize all of these different kinds of knowledge. All of these were relevant to your decisions. And although at a certain point, the sort of scientific knowledge about infection rates were really important, probably more important than anything else, at other points, they weren't more important than some of these other ones, whether psychology, public opinion, ethical knowledge. And the task of really handling any kind of real-life human experience, certainly any government one, is the wisdom to realize that there are multiple perspectives, multiple kinds of knowledge which you have to synthesize. And you have to synthesize in different ways depending on context. And yet science provides no means of doing that at all. It can give you, the epidemiological forecasts on infection rates and your hospitals being overrun, but it can't tell you how to weigh up mental health and physical health, the needs of the young and the old, the economy against health, all the things which in practice we all observed happening. And of course, climate change is another example of this. So I argue we actually need new methods and theories of synthesis, because this in practice is what's so vital. And I did a little study about 1.5 years ago of how countries and governments around the world had handled intelligence through the pandemic. And none of them could answer this most basic question. How did you do this work of synthesis? So very finally, one of the other things this takes me to is the question of skills. That is the School of Athens, by the way, by Raphael. And what skills do we need for our decision makers now in this world of very difficult, very complex science? And I think there's quite a big gap both in our officials and the training provided by universities and civil service colleges, but even more for politicians. How should politicians be trained to play their roles? In most of Europe, they get no training at all. There are a few exceptions. So in Australia, there's a new initiative which trains politicians. An entrepreneur there decided the best place he could put his hundreds of millions of dollars was training politicians. That's how he would get the best benefit for the country. And it's a rather good initiative, and it's very sophisticated. It teaches them from all sides to understand systems and transitions, all that stuff. The right is the China Executive Leadership Academy, where I sometimes teach, where ministers, governors, mayors have to go for residential courses 1 or 2 weeks a year. They have to write essays which are marked, and so on. And for mayors, Mike Bloomberg set up an initiative. But in most of the democracies, there's nothing. They learn on the job, and often they are shown to be completely inadequate to their tasks. And the videos of Congress interviewing Mark Zuckerberg and things like that are, the moments when you see just what a massive problem that is, that our people with sovereign power are just not up to the task. Now, there's another side of this, of how we also train up the population and deal with, as it were, the ecosystems of truth. Finland is one of the relatively few countries now teaching kids how to spot conspiracy theories, misinformation, and so on. And we'll hear a little bit later, I think, about how you create, I think we need new kinds of commons where scientific knowledge research is not just provided to people, but they take part in its shaping. And so your Open Research Amsterdam, to me, is a real model of that, of turning science from a sort of closed ivory tower into much more like a platform for sharing, orchestrating, involving the public or stakeholders in guiding the direction of research. We don't have anything like that, I should say, in the UK yet. And these are crucial for that, I think, that politicization in the best sense, the democratization, legitimation of science. So finally, where I think we're headed, and perhaps haven't quite got our theories right, is if 300 years ago we had absolute sovereignty in politics and parliaments and presidents and so on, and then a detached world of science which was neutral and autonomous, I think de facto we need to think about really a shared sovereignty, where on almost any decision, yes, the people, us, the citizens, have a voice, have a right, but actually our pooled collective knowledge, which sometimes we call science, also, I think, makes a claim on decisions, a claim on sovereignty, which sometimes is as strong as the claim of democracy. I don't believe the public are always right. And I think any wise democratic citizenry realizes they shouldn't trust themselves to make all kinds of decisions. They should want to share that sovereignty with knowledge. And that points us to, in a way, I mean, the core argument of the book is that on everything from our diets and our fitness to our climate, science tells us the facts, tells us what is, tells us what's really going on. But only politics and political processes can tell us what matters. And what we really need now are institutions, processes, capabilities which fuse the two together with a bit of bureaucracy as well. And some of this is a bit challenging to the politicians. I've been a bit rude about them. But it's actually just as challenging to the scientists, who often assume they are the heroes of these stories, and yet in many ways I think are not now. And my sort of final claim is that actually I'm being true to the spirit of the Royal Society and the questioning spirit of science in saying so, and in challenging whether one should trust the science. I definitely want, and we have a one-liner we sometimes use in the UK about evidence-based policy, which is the politicians have every right to ignore the evidence, but no right to be ignorant of the evidence. We want a government which uses all the available knowledge, but it then still has to ultimately decide what matters and what is to be done. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Geoff Mulgan, for this introduction to when science meets power. Science has a lot of power, of course, already on its own, like you just explained. Maybe to kick off a few things, and then we get in two more people into our conversation, one by one. When did you realize that you wanted to write this book? Was it during the pandemic, living through it, or is it much older? Because it was so sort of obvious that science and politics were clashing, to say the least, or?
Well, I think it was the first month of the pandemic when my government said it was going to follow the science. I actually wrote a short piece that month on why that was a bit of a silly idea.
like the last cartoon you just showed.
Exactly. And even then, I don't know if you remember March 2020, science, as is often the case, had multiple views about face masks, about infection patterns. There was not a single science you could follow. And even then, it was clear on decisions on lockdowns. You have to make some judgment about what might be the effects of isolation or mental health. And the decision makers seem not to have the means of doing that. So that's what made me think there was a problem. And the great thing about the lockdowns is you have lots of time to write books.
Yeah. That's
nothing else to do.
Yeah, right. Yeah, actually, that's funny. Mark Rutte said exactly the same thing, that our government was going to implement measures based on the scientific evidence. Mm-hmm. And when he did so, everybody thought it was a great idea, of course. And then later on, I think a lot of people start to realize that, you have different and rich scientists and those sort of. We come to the public later. Sorry, but and there are people at home, so I need to come to you with a microphone. Otherwise, they won't be able to understand a bit. But then you're saying, like you're somewhere in the first page. I just looked it up, and I think I just found it. That a view is popular does not make it right, of course. Hmm? And
is that a shocking idea?
Yeah.
Yes.
And like you right here, but how do we? Because you're saying we need these new hybrids, which are the idea that the sovereign people need to share its sovereignty with knowledge. And can we get a little bit more? What kind of hybrids, new institutions? Can you get any sort of a concrete example of that? Because yes, I do understand. I think everybody would like our sovereignty to be shared with real knowledge. But which knowledge, or how are we going to do that?
Well, I think it's worth exploring the principle in the first place. Is it correct that sovereignty should be shared? And in the book, I quote quite a lot of different political systems which are founded in this idea of absolute sovereignty for politics over everything. Mm-hmm. And in a way, it's why I started with that question to all of you: how much do you use science in your life? Certainly in my life, there are lots of things where I don't have the expertise to make judgments. And wisdom, for me, is to give sovereignty to some others, like doctors or mechanics to fix my car and so on. And I would argue that's true of a wise public. It realizes the fact that it has voted for something doesn't make it right, and is much wiser to try and build in shared sovereignty through institutions with different kind of expertise. That may be on financial issues with a central bank, it may be on disease control. A whole array of different kinds of knowledge require their own institutions, often deliberately protected from day-to-day politics, often deliberately protected from the public's own wishes. And to some extent, this has been the direction of a lot of governance in the last 50 or 100 years, to multiply these kind of quasi-autonomous institutions, because that's a more efficient way of making decisions in the public interest than us all voting once a week on what monetary policy should be, which is a road to disaster. So then the question becomes, what do those institutions look like? And exactly as you say, what kinds of knowledge do they need to be mobilizing to make those decisions? And thirdly, in many cases, what's then their relationship with the public, where they explain their dilemmas? So just going on artificial intelligence, I advocated about 10 years ago the creation of essentially a regulator for AI based on the fertilization model, to have at least a public entity which would be explaining things when they went wrong, would be making judgments about targeted advertising or facial recognition cameras, or when we had a scandal the same year as you had an AI scandal, with school exams being decided by algorithm. Yeah. Thousands of school kids marched on the streets of London saying, "Kill the algorithm." And there was no institution there to explain the dilemmas, the trade-offs, the judgments being made even then on a huge scale by governments. And so that's the bit of institutional design which is needed, which is partly technical but also relational. It's also about how it manages a relationship with the public.
Yeah, because if you do make those institutions, I mean, we've done that. We've done it with banks, with central banks, for instance. We don't vote every day on how much the pound or the euro is worth, and so the central. But then you get, of course, very quickly the problem that there is no alternative problem, that large parts of what we decide on in society are decided on by institutions which are too far from politics, so we can't influence them. So, and then it becomes less democratic, and the people start losing trust, because they can vote on all those things which they think are sort of really important, like how the exchange rate in the end influences us. But no, we can never decide on it because it's too far from politics.
Yeah. So one of the things which has happened in central banks, you don't have one anymore, of course, here. We've still got one, is...
Everybody still thinks it will happen. There's one in Frankfurt, of course,
Yeah. So I mean, in the old days, they used to make their decisions very secretly. But I think many central banks now around the world have transparent voting processes. So certainly the Bank of England, when they meet each month or two, we'll know that 3 of them have voted for an interest rate fall, 4 for an interest rate cut, 5 for keeping the same. And I think this is crucial for almost all fields of science, that we become more honest about multiplicity, about diversities of opinion, not a single opinion, and not, again, to pretend there is a monolithic truth in science which has to be followed or has to be authoritative. Now, it still will be difficult for the public, perhaps day to day, to influence those decisions. But I think the opening up of those, in some ways, quite technical institutions, and acknowledging the complexities and ambiguities of knowledge is key. It does, however, take you to, one of the big problems with my argument, which is a very political point, that in most countries, now I guess including this, there's quite a large part of the public who are relatively at ease with ambiguity and complexity and uncertainty, and the ministers saying, we don't really know. And my guess is there's quite a large group, maybe a third, who really hate that and want certainty, really dislike complexity, and there's probably a group in the middle. So how you tailor the modern politics of science to a very diverse public in this almost fundamental epistemological way, I don't really know. In one route, and I'd be fascinated in any of your views on this, I thought during the pandemic we had in some ways a quite odd position where all the governments were communicating with their public essentially using 20th century means. TV, radio, posters, blanket messages, whereas the opposing groups, the anti-vaxxers and so on, were using Facebook algorithms to target their messages by cognitive style and so on. Mm-hmm. And
some political parties did as well.
And lots of political parties, were using those tools. Mm-hmm. And so the question is it, in the future, will we need governments to become much more modulated, much more targeted in how they communicate, given how diverse people are in their appetite for complexity? Or will that actually undermine trust if they start doing that and having different messages for different people depending on who they are? Taiwan is the one country which did do quite a bit of this, very successfully.
To counter also the communist China, the mainland China propaganda also, partly.
Yeah, but they were doing it on vaccines and the pandemic.
They did it on pandemic policies as well.
And using humour. I mean, there's an interesting story because there was a group of hackers basically brought into the government and therefore with a very different style of communication. But nearly all the Western governments I know used only 20th century means.
Yeah, sort of blanket approach. Yeah. And that's a very interesting point, of course, if you say that maybe 1/3 of the population wants clarity and directions. And no uncertainty, and 1/3, is really happy with complexity. And what would your opinion be? Sort of having, indeed, two approaches in order to convince your population of the measures you're taking, or?
So my hunch is we do have to go a bit in that direction to a more tailored, personalized approaches, and obviously this is helped by AI and platforms, but that itself has to be done in a very transparent way so it's not seen as a new kind of evil state manipulation. But I think it's reasonable that everyone should be communicated in the way they want to be communicated to. I don't think it's obvious that should be absolutely one size fits all.
And maybe to close this part off, you showed the chart of the Democrats and the Republicans and how they sort of change position in whether they trust. So you said science has become politically polarized, and obviously, at least to my mind, that's a bad thing because that means that half of the population that maybe would not believe anything that comes out of university or something. But then you say political. We need a sort of a politicization. So you said towards the end of your speech, politicization of science.
Yeah.
So how do we fit in those two?
Yeah. So in my use of the word politicization, in politicization of science, I was not meaning the party politicization of science. And I also in the book say it's important scientists don't become partisan, but do become political. And by that I mean that they should be willing to get engaged with the big arguments of the time, like climate change or mental health. But it's quite important they keep at one remove from party politics because that will undermine their credibility as scientists. And all the examples I gave were really of science being more honest about its place in collective decision-making in politics in its widest sense, rather than pretending it can stand outside. And this is not a new point. I mean, the people like Rotblat and Pugwash in the 50s who campaigned on nuclear weapons were very much scientists getting stuck into politics in that sense. And I talk in the book about the Biological Weapons Convention and many other examples of scientists trying to take responsibility for that. But it's politics in a much more fundamental meaning, which again goes back to Aristotle, who defined politics as just how the community makes decisions collectively. That's what I mean by politics.
Yeah. It is an important difference. Yeah. I'd like to, at this point, invite Caroline Nevian to sit next to you there. Welcome. Professor here at Amsterdam University, involved from the 80s in emerging network society and digital culture, worked for decades on those sort of things, but now also a professor, but also chief science officer of our city, of the city of Amsterdam, and the founder of Open Research Amsterdam, which we just saw a little, and we're very happy to cooperate with Open Research Amsterdam tonight. To start off, why are you so Open Research Amsterdam? It's tried to share knowledge and explain. Why are you so excited about what
this book?
Mulgan, this book and what Mulgan writes in it?
Yeah. Well, as
because I mean, you're not concerned with power in that respect. You would.
Very nice. This is my image. Yeah, you just say the right thing to me. Very good. No, so I was a professor in Delft before I came here, and before that I was a cultural entrepreneur for a long time. But I thought that science is sometimes very detached from the world, extremely detached, which is why you call it politicization. I think they need to be engaged. I mean, we have found many ways to do technology assessments or value-sensitive design of all those things, and it doesn't make a difference. That the misalignment with the SDGs and what scientists are working on, and how they're not working together also between the sciences, is quite mind-blowing, actually, given their own evidence. It's shocking that it's shocking that boards don't manage to address it. So the nice thing is that I thought I go to Amsterdam, local. Yeah, I go extremely local. And the word I miss, we're going to have a debate, in your book is public space. Because it's in a local community, it's the streets, the water.
The physical public space?
It's where you live, your neighborhood. Yeah, like you also talk about your neighborhood. In your neighborhood, people come together. And the big challenges of the city are very local. It's obesitas, it's climate change, it's water, it's food. I mean, you all know the big challenges we are facing. And these are very local. And what I find when I came to Amsterdam, they said, well, you are going to connect science and the challenges of the city, so I thought we need a platform. And it has been made with all the people who use it. So we publish all the research of the city from all the different departments, but also from the universities, from the Waternet, from the province, from the transport board. I mean, we have 18 partners now, we're going to get another 10. So we share the research we do on the big challenges that we face. And then you see that actually a person who's very concerned with obesitas from the public health department or a youth nurse or a social worker or even Albert Heijn suddenly share the same challenge and they easily work together. They love to work together because their knowledge is complementary to each other. Like in a public space, I like my neighbors, I like my shop. I don't have to be the shop, I like there is a shop. So the diversity of knowledge is our day-to-day experience of life. And it's really weird that science missed out on this. That they think they have the premise of knowledge. They don't. It's just
there's more knowledge than the knowledge in university.
There's just one kind of knowledge, which for certain questions is really important at certain times. But other knowledge, the knowledge of the crafts, the knowledge of emotions, the knowledge of ethics, they're all very important. And the interaction is what matters. And we find, we've been building now on this sort of, we call it the city ecology, the research ecology in the city. We find also that in European cities we start a city science initiative, so people like me from different cities come together. We find that actually in the last 5-10 years, most cities started someone like me. We're always a small group, and sometimes we have different names, but we do the same. We bring people together, different kinds of knowledge, and we work on the challenges that are local.
And you said we're going to have a debate, so
what I love about Geoff's book, I mean, really...
You're going to disagree with it.
Yeah, you're going to disagree, yeah. But what I love about the book is for the first time, I saw a reflection on what is my day-to-day practice. Because the clash between the logic of the civil servant, the logic of the researcher, and the logic of the politician is a day-to-day reality for me. But it's very hard to understand it. And you wrote beautifully about it with so many words. But then I missed the local perspective because you look at national. And so then communication becomes very important. Where if you work local, for example, we have a Energy Lab Zuidoost. All the knowledge institutes work there. It's run by the grond en ontwikkeling, so the people who do the reinvestment in Amstel 3. So
the soil.
Who build the new houses because they want to use the heat of the data centers. We don't know the business model. The Johan Cruijff Arena is part of it. So The business world is there, the universities are there every year, 300 students, and it's run by the city to build up the knowledge on top of each other. Structurally, over time, and then you find that the researchers say, hey, we now find fundamental research questions in the city. For example, the Institute for Biodiversity and Ecosystems Dynamics, very nice institute, says fundamental research is now in the city. Yeah. What do we do with the reds?
Yeah, because
Nobody knows.
Because in agriculture there's no biodiversity left at all, so we are left to the cities. But back to Geoff.
Yeah. So what do you think about public space? What's wrong with public space? It doesn't appear in your book.
It doesn't. So this is a terrible failing.
Interesting. I got one.
Yeah. Maybe I could share 2 or 3 because I totally agree with what's been said. Both data points and experiences. So there are some surveys done in the last year or 2 in the UK about public attitudes to science and R&D, which are quite surprising. They show only a minority think R&D benefits people like them. They show very small percentages thinking government funding for R&D is good for them. And almost no one knows about science activity in their local area. Mm-hmm. And yet we know that nearly always there's more trust in things if you can see it locally, if it's something visible and tangible. And these surveys, and I don't know what it'd be like here, reveal almost a massive problem. Our universities are just doing, and our public labs, a terrible job at explaining what they're doing, why they're doing it, how it would benefit not them, the students and professors, but the public. The second thing I wanted to say is a failed attempt I was part of, which is one of the reasons I'm so interested with what you're doing. In the mid-2000s, I managed to get a thing we call the London Collaborative, which was the 3 tiers of government, national, city, and they're called boroughs, to create a shared space to work together on problem solving. And we would gather the sort of 2,000 leaders of the city and blah, blah, blah. And one part of that was creating a place where the city governments could say, these are the things we really need help on, and talk to all the universities of London, which were very strong, and see what help they could provide in answering these questions. It seemed like a no-brainer. Mm-hmm. This should be happening. And then Boris Johnson was elected mayor, and it was stopped completely. We've never had anything like it since. But it seems to me just obvious that should be happening. And just a third point where, again, I hope you can be a pioneer. One of the other things I did in the pandemic was trying to map the systems of everyday life, where I live and so on. And I don't know if any of you have ever tried doing it, but try and find out in your street, your neighborhood, how does water happen, or electricity, or communications, or food. And it turns out these are, certainly in Britain, completely opaque. It's almost impossible to find out what's actually going on. It's almost as difficult to find out about power. About 2 weeks ago, I published a quiz, 10 simple questions about power in your area, and even very highly educated people can hardly answer any of them because it's become so, again, opaque. And I think this is one of the reasons for feelings of detachment and disempowerment, is that so much of what governs our life is literally opaque and invisible. Yeah. And so anything which can be done to make it easier really to see the world around you, as well as the decisions, must be good for democracy in the long run.
But then there's a big question I have, that one of the big issues on the long-term challenges that we have in the city is that politicians come and go every 4 years. While the challenges they require 20, 30 years investment. So we try it to make it in certain areas, but the politicians come and go. There is no training, as you say. There's also...
they're not interested because it's too long. It's 30 years, and they only have a 4-year...
Yeah, and there's internal power dynamics. Who has to do the job? It's not transparent.
You write about it in the book as well.
Yeah.
It's sort of...
Yeah. So we've got a time horizon challenge. That's partly another sovereignty question, and some places in the world are thinking about what institutions can represent future generations in today's decisions, which is sharing sovereignty with the future. Many countries, and Britain, I think, I'm working on some possible designs for the near term in Britain, where for sort of infrastructure, pensions, and climate, we try and create more cross-party long-term structures which can tie into 10, 20-year plans, which has happened at times in the past, but has weakened recently. Because if you don't do that, you get a wholly dysfunctional governance. And for me, the real weirdness of the mid-2020s is life expectancy of a child born in Amsterdam this year is probably, 95 in reality? Or
Depends
something
which neighborhood you live.
Depends where you live.
10 years difference.
Yeah, and yet in government, 10 years is the very long term, which is insane. And we have this very weird system where for physical, maybe we might disagree on this, physical infrastructures or airports, governments do look 50, 60 years into the future, they amortize, they look at it as an investment, whereas with people, it's an annual decision. Spending is organized annually. And yet now people last longer than buildings and infrastructures. So we have a complete mismatch of our machineries and methods and systems and the reality of our lives.
Education versus infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I do find that we have in Amsterdam about 20 academic workshops, like 70s model, where you have different institutions from the knowledge, universities, hogescholen, etc., ROC, work together with different departments of the municipality. Some of these exist 10, 15 years. It's because the politicians are not there. So you also described that the logic of the civil servant and the logic of the researcher, they quite go well together. One likes order and the other one likes detachment, so they go well together. And then the politicians bring in the emotion, as you say.
Happy chaos, maybe. That was how you do it.
Yeah, right.
No, but it's interesting that the moment the politicians come, it becomes much harder. Then the whole structure starts to adapt to the politician, to please the politician, because that means they get more space. But as long as you stay under the radar, these structures go on for years. You recognize this. So what do we need to train the politicians to? How do you imagine this training will change this?
Well, I mean, one argument, and I mentioned the various what work centres we have in the UK, they essentially operate a little bit below the radar. Yeah. So they carry on doing their work. The ministers come and go. We have so many ministers in Britain. We have about, we have 3 prime ministers a year these days, in a sense, the bureaucrats and the researchers get on with stuff below the radar, and they let the politicians have their culture wars, and it doesn't really affect very much in the real world. But that's a slightly unhappy approach. So this is why I like the McKinnon Institute I mentioned in Australia. Australia has a very kind of brutal politics. I don't know if any of you have ever watched videos of the Australian Parliament where they just abuse each other brutally. Yeah. It's very, very rude. But this academy, which the main parties have committed to sending some of their top politicians, the ones who will be ministers in maybe 3 or 4 years, they have to go to these residential classes where they learn, really sophisticated thinking about demography and science and climate and da-da-da. And my hope is that will enable them to be much more useful than participants in the kind of
Did you see any sort of positive result from that? Because there's a Swedish thing like that. It's called Apolitical Academy. And the Balie is involved at this moment of trying to get that model here to Holland, because there's so many politicians who don't, haven't been trained at all from new parties and from other parties. But do you really think that helps educating politicians? And then I want to go to Alexander to get him on the table, but
well, all I'll say in China, having spent quite a bit of time in their academies where their politicians, there's a different meaning of politician obviously in China, but they have to, I 10, 15 years ago used to teach green economy and, wind farms and batteries to these governors of huge provinces. And there's definitely much more respect for science and engineering in the Chinese system. I think it has helped them sometimes make much better longer-term judgments. Electric vehicles, they are way ahead of Europe and North America, partly because of that. It's going backwards. I mean, President Xi has, I think, reversed things, and they made big mistakes during the pandemic. So I don't want to sort of romanticize China, But I would definitely say that governors who have done intense residential learning are more impressive decision makers than ones who are just making it up as they go
It's
along.
an interesting example, though, because they are not politicians, like you said. They are members of the Communist Party, but they're governors.
Yeah, but the
And they're
Communist
not
Party is a political party.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I mean, I'm really serious.
Granted,
It
but-
has to retain legitimacy,
Yeah.
and it really focuses on legitimacy.
Yeah. I like to introduce Alexander Renner-Khan. I just said you're a politician, but you're much more than that. You just have been a member of the Senate for D66, the left-leaning Progressive Liberal Party. But that was just a tiny batch of your very impressive resume. Mathematician by training and chairman of the Social and Economic Council, among many other things. But welcome, Alexander.
Thank you.
If you listen to our conversation this far, and just coming back to the whole idea of educating politicians, I think you wrote an essay. It's called "Can Our Society?" Can our society?
I think it's can we afford incompetent
Can
leaders?
democracies afford incompetent leaders? Yeah.
It's a slightly loaded question.
Leading,
Rhetorical.
leading maybe.
Rhetorical. Let me first and foremost say I'm very happy to be here. I think this is a fantastic book that I strongly recommend to everybody here and watching. We're very happy to have this fantastic author. This is just a great list of topics to worry about.
Yeah, it's endless. but if you have to give us one reason why it's so important to read it, what would it be?
Well, let me start
Maybe
by
two, but
observing
one.
this is not, as much as I respect this work, as I hope has become clear already, this is of course not a new issue at all.
No.
And this question has been with us from the very start of the scientific enterprise, and the more so when science became increasingly successful to address real-world problems. And so the question who sets the scientific agenda and what happens to its outcomes is to some extent as old as science itself, and of course it definitely became urgent, let's say the early 20th century, when science became really a very competent tool to address very down-to-earth practical issues. And at the end of the day, the outcome of that debate, at least a temporary outcome, has been to grant a lot of influence in who sets the agenda to scientists themselves. And that is maybe one of the great breakthroughs of perhaps especially the debate in the UK. This is known as the Haldane Principle in honor of a British civil servant, one of your predecessors, who figured out that maybe the best way to set the right agenda for scientists was to essentially let the scientists take care of it themselves, a form of peer review, let them figure out where the best opportunities are. And let's observe, first of all, that system has served us surprisingly well over decades. It has generated, I think, a very strong idea that academic freedom is something we should treasure. That, of course, at the end of the day, what happens to the outcomes is to a large extent determined by who pays the bill, which is always, not always, but largely the government, increasingly industry, but initially largely the government. And it being the government, at the very end of the day, it is the democratic system that has a very strong influence. And if there's one thing that worries me in your fantastic story, it is precisely where you try to reform democracies to be better equipped to deal with this particular challenge. You talk about assemblies, about new institutions, to sit on this interface and do a better job. But my point would be at the end of the day, at the very end of the day, frankly, I think, with all the mistakes that they have, with all their incompetences, with all their shortcomings, with their poor training and what have you, I would rather have elected democratic politicians be in charge of our future. That is what I would prefer. Of course, we can do a better job in training them. And I like your ideas. I think there are additional ones. By the way, in the Netherlands, we have the NSOB, Nederlandse School voor Openbaar bestuur,
Yeah, we have
especially created for this purpose, not maybe doing the best possible job, but at least there is an institution to take care of maybe doing it in a better way in the future. But again, I think the very fundamental issue is, as much as representative democracy is a lousy system, it is probably better than all its competitors. That, I think, is a very fundamental insight. And I'm a little bit worried that you seem to be ready to shelve that principle.
Can I make two comments?
Please.
So one is about history.
It's the fundamental discussion.
One of the pleasures for me, and the slight shocks writing this book, was delving a bit into the history of politics and power. And we were talking actually before, early this evening, about Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, which both had a very intimate relationship with science. It's slightly shocking how many of the great physicists and biologists were very happy to be Nazis. Stalin managed, it's a complicated story of scientific distortion and co-option. And in a way, after the Second World War, there was a legitimate swing against the democracies, said we need to reassert the autonomy of science. Exactly this principle, scientists are better placed to judge their own direction of research than totalitarian states, and that there was a sort of link between that and freedom and democracy and the West's values. So that's one part of it. And I would still want in any system there to be quite a bit of space for scientists to pursue their own desires. They're to speculate about, not to be governed by anyone. And maybe we can come back to what is the right balance to strike between self-directed science versus other-directed science. The second is the extraordinary fact, which I didn't know, that in the early 50s, a third of all global science R&D was funded by the US Department of Defense, which is an incredible fact of the world, and the figure now is about 2 or 3%. And that's been a huge shift, partly to India and China, but also to business, to the Googles and so on. And that's part of the power story maybe we might come on to. I actually agree with your other point about representative democracy. And indeed, the kinds of entities I think we need, and this is why the Human Fertilization Embryology Authority is quite interesting, are ones which actually can not displace elected representatives, but can pull them in. And indeed, I think this was one of the mistakes of some of the citizen assemblies which have been held recently. So, for example, Macron set up an assembly on climate change, which came up with, I think, 92 recommendations, all of which I think he then ignored. And everyone said, oh, my God, that's terrible. But I think, in my view, the design was slightly wrong. It didn't have either sufficient integration with elected representatives. I think they should have been involved, maybe not in the very first stage, but in some of the stages of proposing, deliberating, deciding on actions. And the bureaucracy had no role either. So I think we have a design task of how do we create assemblies which are simultaneously open to the public, even random, but also can bring in the vital legitimating power of representative democracy. And then if they're going to turn into real actions and policies, bring the bureaucrats in to analyze how much they'll cost, what the practicalities are. Yeah.
And the people.
Otherwise, we get this worst of all worlds where Macron appeared to be letting the public decide on climate change policy, then rejects all of their proposals and leaves people even more alienated than before.
Well, I was just about to essentially cover that same idea. When you talk about the failure of traditional democracies to cope well with this very complex and demanding task, for which, again, they are poorly taught, poorly equipped, go away after 4 years and a few other shortcomings, then of course one of the ways to bring science and knowledge closer to the electorate is to set up the kind of assembly that you were just talking about, the G1000-like models. And now where did they become successful? I think at the end of the day, a very interesting case study is in Ireland. This kind of structure at the end of the day generated a fundamental change in abortion politics in Ireland, something that would never have been accomplished in a regular system. And why did it work? Because at the end of the day, again, the unanimous verdict of this particular group had such moral pressure and visibility that politicians could simply not ignore it. Yeah. That, I think, is a model I like.
Yeah.
But wherever the suggestion is that we should really transfer significant responsibility from the people we elect to the people they select,
Yeah.
I get very nervous.
So again, I think I agree with you, unfortunately. And maybe I might open this up to an issue which I've been working on more recently, which was partly prompted by what happened here last year. And this is the question of how does a society hold a society-wide conversation now? What in the late 2020s are the means where the whole of a society of 10, 20, 50 million can feel they're part of a difficult conversation about choices of the long term involving sacrifice and so on. And in the autumn, I hosted a couple of events where we brought together people who'd been involved in such exercises, some successful, some unsuccessful, to see if there were some lessons. And climate obviously is the most pressing one. Argentina's abortion reform was a really interesting one from 2 or 3 years ago. Australia's failed voice referendum last year was another one on Aboriginal power. You mentioned Ireland. There's actually quite a few of these. And our conclusion was, and again, probably just echoing what you say, the methods have to involve the public, sometimes representative random samples, but they have to also involve the mass media. If they don't tie in the mass media, they won't reach the public. And they have to involve the elected politicians. And in a way, that was the moral of the story, that we needed new hybrids, the pure citizens' assemblies, the pure...
But I want to interrupt you and be more precise. Right. They have to involve the elected politicians. I would tend to say the ultimate responsibility in any really basic, major decision in a democracy should be the exclusive domain of the elected politicians.
Yeah. So V-Taiwan, which some of you will know, which I've been a fan of for a few years, which is, I think, the most advanced digital democracy in the world, created by Audrey Tang and these other sort of hackers who became ministers in the government, allows very large numbers of the public to take part in proposing ideas, commenting and so on, but all the decisions still rest with the parliament.
But you actually both, I mean...
Maybe we don't disagree then.
You mentioned
Sorry about that.
That's actually wonderful. But you mentioned in your speech, of course, this Hegel's dialectic of master and servant. So I think you're both worried about the same thing, basically, which you describe as science. The slave has gained de facto sovereignty of its own. I'm quoting now from the book, that sits along traditional sovereignty of politics. The servant has to some extent become the master. And that's one of the problems we're facing.
But that's
what I like about this book is the title. The title is not When Science and Politics Interact. The title of the book is When Science Meets Power. Mm-hmm. It's a different word from politics, but that, of course, is the crucial issue. Where do we want the power to sit? And I know where I want it to sit.
But I think there's also a perspective from the sciences part. Mm-hmm. So I was for a long time in the technical university, where it's extremely hard to have any ethical debate on the things that people put all their life effort in. Now I'm in a social science department, and I make the joke in some conferences. I say, I never thought Trump would be president. I never thought the social sciences would be abolished in 3-4 years, because they have become obsolete. They don't interact. So there is a very big thing that I see happening. I coach researchers to be able to work in the city, because you cannot go to a neighborhood and just extract data, just take it. And the attitude of extraction, of even exploitation, from the sciences to the real world, whether it's the nature, whether it's the people, whether it's the culture. Look at the internet, no respect whatsoever for any culture. We just go. There was no board. We tried for many years to create more governance and all these things. Didn't happen because the politicians didn't engage and the scientists were not prepared to talk value. So it's very nice to talk now power and politicians, but I think there is a really fundamental thing missing, which is that the sciences are not open to engage with the world. Because this idea of objectivity has created a master without compassion. And that's the worst master you can have.
Science as a master, you mean?
Science as a master has lost compassion.
Alexander doesn't seem to agree. That's hopefully
Challenging him now.
That's for me as a
Well,
chair. Is
I'm a mathematician, and I know what
I know it's
truth
beautiful.
sits.
I know mathematicians.
But
yeah.
that is too easy an answer. Let me also be frank. When I heard you complain about scientists, I was reminded, and I know this is not what you intended, but nevertheless, I was reminded by a quote that I really dislike intensely. And this is when people say, you know what, science just like another opinion.
No, that's not what I mean at all.
I know, but you're
Not at all.
But let me know. I think you may be getting dangerously close to that sentiment if you're not careful.
I think
And
scientists...
I certainly would want to stay very, very far away from that, because scientific knowledge, when properly derived, properly tested, properly subjected to continuous testing, merciless testing, objective testing, the whole rigmarole, scientific knowledge and scientific insights are to some extent in a class of their own.
Yeah,
And deserve
I'm a scientist.
respect.
I love science. I agree. I love the methodology. I mean, I wish politics used more of the methodology of the science. Falsification. Talk is such a way you can disagree.
Popperian.
Yeah, of course. It's really fundamental. So it's a pity you make this. It's not at all what I intend to do.
I'm sure
And
it
I
is.
hope we can still talk about the issue that we are facing. Yeah? Because a university like Delft is so much military money in there. And the students don't even realize what they work on. The social sciences in America are now directly connected to CIA. I was shocked to hear it. Social sciences...
In the
we are
50s,
not
it was 1/3 of, we just heard.
Yeah, but I mean, it's now 100%. It's shocking. But so...
But what is your solution here? Because you bring up a very interesting example, which
I
I want
need more
to...
engagement to talk about the politics, like what you argue. I wouldn't use the word politics because you get confusion maybe, but it is what we need.
But what does engagement mean? Let me take your example, which I think is probably one of the nastiest and therefore most interesting one in the list. Defense-based research. Defense-based research, starting with the people who built the atom bomb. And now people who design very nasty missiles and rockets and artillery and
Enhanced viruses.
munition and what have you. Not stuff we like particularly. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians now want that stuff to defend their freedom. What do we think of that kind of research? Do you think this is sort of a good thing? Do we criticize people who develop these nasty tools for not being sufficiently engaged?
I like it to
I
go to
don't
a
know.
new level. I like it to go to another level where at least we discuss about it, where we talk about it, where we know about it, where we also bring it in relation to the social context where we're living, to the values we cherish. So I think as scientists, we don't have enough value debates.
Can
But
I-
what you-
Let's hear.
Let me weigh in on this. I mean, certainly on defence, and we're probably in an era of there'd like to be more wars. We have very powerful adversaries we don't share values with. I would be pretty worried if there wasn't any defence research happening in the next 10 or 20 years. But what I think we do need is a different, this is where the universities come in, formation of the scientists and the engineers as well. I mean, one of the things which has gone wrong in the world in the last 20 or 30 years is as much engineering as science. The most powerful figures in Silicon Valley having a very narrow, linear view of their knowledge and their discipline, not much sense of history, no sense of ethics, no sense of, in many cases, of responsibility and culture. And some of the pathologies, at least, of the internet and AI are an effect of, I think, a problem of their own formation. Weirdly, the chief execs of some of the big Silicon Valley firms a few years ago were asking, I was part of a little group, they almost wanted a curriculum to retrain their engineers so they weren't so myopic about the sort of things which had hit Facebook and others. I've just in the last few months sort of been part of a new undergraduate degree we've launched on science and engineering for social change, which tries to integrate the rigorous engineering, but with a sense of whole systems, including ethics and politics and so on. And I think that's going quite well. There are similar courses all over the place. But I think this is one aspect of science and engineering being so powerful now. I think with that power comes a responsibility to ensure that the people coming out of those programs do have a wider vision, aren't so narrow, so linear, and so at risk of terrible ethical mistakes.
It's a great case study, and a very great case study to, maybe if you should pursue it for a minute or so, the internet and especially social media and the way they disrupt our lives. We have just thank God, have passed the point in this country that we're actively discouraging, hopefully ultimately forbidden, the use of smartphones in schools. Okay, the least I can say is already 5 years ago, I started to write about it. I saw it happening. Friends of mine in education talked about it. Basically, we wasted 5 years because children who have gone through this experience have undergone something that will transform their cognitive abilities for the rest of their lives.
But Alexander,
So
we
here,
do this.
but my question is this: if this is something we now see very clearly, hopefully, and do something about, how could this have gone differently? And at which point should what engineer have said, I'm not going to develop this particular tool because I can see ahead and I can see what's coming and I don't want to be part of it?
Well, with the internet, and I actually, 20 years ago, was part of the attempts then to create places which could at least have that conversation. This was pre-smartphone. But in the early 2000s, it was clear, and I think I even wrote a bit about it in that book, which is 97, that the internet, brought all sorts of risks of misinformation, lies spreading, disruption
Addiction.
of childhood.
Yeah, but that was all
exactly.
clear.
They were being deliberately designed for addiction. I remember a conversation with Google in 2003 about trying to link truth into their search engine. And being almost sort of laughed out of court, why on earth would we bother to do that? We've got no reason to. And so I think the whole industry intimidated, and I saw this happening, politicians,
Yes.
for fear that if they in any way restrained this incredibly powerful technology, their societies and economies would lose out. As a result, no institutions were created to orchestrate that debate, to weigh up whether there needed to be new rules, new penalties for abuses, and so on. And I think historians will view this as an extraordinary failure of the world, and actually a bit of failure of universities, I should say.
But your answer is new institutions should have been created to foresee this and stop it.
Regulate.
Well, can I say something?
Right.
Yes,
If we talk schools, Kennisnet was started in '95 in the Netherlands. We were involved with Waag Society. There were many, many learning environments.
Yep.
And two big sellouts happened. The Ministry of OCW gave the Kennisnet to the cable, we called it the kabelboeren, the cable companies, right?
The cable farmers.
They had no educational interest. Yeah, the cable farms. No educational interest.
Right.
No knowledge. They just wanted connectivity and paid for cables. So that was the first, Rob Rapmunt, I still remember, who tried to make it work. It was a disaster zone. Then there were all these learning environments to try to make it work. Then the universities did a big sellout because they did Microsoft Blackboard. It was terrible. There was a serve with so many other possibilities, and we all got stuck for 20 years with Blackboard. And only the last few years it's changing. Old-fashioned models, and there were all the educational faculty at Hogeschool van Amsterdam. There was a whole portfolio system working, but it had to do with the old-fashioned ideas of control. So the old culture and the new culture did not match, and it was a clash, and we did a sellout.
Now I'm going to change the conversation a little bit, but this is because now we're talking about when science becomes power, and not means power, but becomes power. But maybe the last topic before going to the audience, as I promised and as we always do, we have a new phenomenon in many ways in power. We have people in power or who are anti-science. And you mentioned, you showed a picture, a very funny picture, of course, of Trump. It's not funny at all, but you have to laugh if you look at his face, and then have his solution to COVID next to it. But Bolsonaro is the same. We do have, politicians. And that's maybe to start out with you, Alexander. I mean, we do have politicians now, sometimes elected politicians in power, who are actively against science, who actually get elected on that ticket.
God bless academic freedom is part of my answer. God bless academic freedom. At least some people inside some of the universities, hopefully all of them, have an opportunity not to care at all about what Donald Trump thinks and can just pursue their own thoughts, their own ideas, publish them, advocate them, work for them, try to create something useful out of them. Let's hope that that part of the balance stays there forever.
Yeah.
How's that for an answer?
I think I agree on that, but how to, if we talk about scientific insights and scientific knowledge and influencing power, a lot of the power actually actively discourages belief in science. Is that
Science is challenging. It's about doubt. It's about skepticism. It's about falsification, which is the opposite of, in some ways, what you want as a ruler, which is what you want, validation, regardless. And I mean, it's amazing the number of political leaders who, in the pandemic, came up with bizarre cures. I think I have a paragraph on some of the strange
Trump, I
ones.
think, was the leader in the
He was the
pack.
leader, but there was a lot of competition of people who said a particular herbal tea or lemon, and some actually invented their own cures, which they were convinced would fix the problem. So we undoubtedly have that, though in a way some of them are just responding to their public. I think it's misleading to say the problem is the leader. I mean, Trump is only where he is because there's a large body of the US public who are equally skeptical of science.
Well, but they're encouraged by somebody in power, so of authority, to not believe science.
But it's deeper. I mean, belief in Darwinian evolution, I think, only hit 50% in the last year or two.
In America.
In America.
And there are parts of America where you can't even teach about evolution, right? So, I mean, they'll never know.
Exactly. So that's one danger. And then I think the other is China, which we talked a bit about before, which is paradoxically, in some ways, the large state with the most scientists and engineers in its ruling echelons. And one of Xi's potential successors is a rather impressive scientist and engineer who's now party secretary in Shanghai. And yet in the party schools, which I was talking about positively a little while ago, in their curriculum, Marxism-Leninism has slowly been, or quite rapidly been, taking up more and more space and squeezing out other things, which it calls itself scientific, but in a way this is a different kind of anti-science movement of the assertion of a political ideology against that questioning spirit. And I think this will harm China in the medium term, as it's always harmed totalitarian states in the past. If you go too far in squeezing out that freedom to tell things as they are, to challenge, your society becomes collectively stupider. There's just no way around that.
Yeah, maybe to some extent it may be as simple as that, although it's as hard as it is. But doesn't this whole development cause you to rethink your advocacy of the politicization of science?
No.
But I think it's about engagement. But can we maybe change
I thought
it
you might say that.
But maybe we can change it into engagement. But there's so many students now who are very engaged, who really want to work on climate change or good neighborhoods.
Fantastic.
That's a great generation.
Fantastic.
So that makes a huge, and their engagement is more a given because they are very worried about their future.
Yeah, it's politicization. It's not political. Huh?
And I think this local point is really key.
Awareness.
Yeah.
Awareness.
Awareness, yeah.
I mean, in secondary schools, I used to be involved in a network of secondary schools, and we tried moving quite a lot of the learning to project-based learning. And in a way, our ideal projects were ones where we'd take something like clean air, where the children would learn to monitor clean air, would learn their maths and their science and so on through that, would also then understand the economy of cars and factories and so on. And through this topic would gain a lot of, in some ways, classic academic disciplinary knowledge, but would also feel agency in the world. Yeah. They would be linked to a sense that they
we
had...
have one university in the Netherlands, in Maastricht, that teaches wherever possible along those lines.
Yeah.
So this is an example we recognize. And my sense is that scientific projects in the future, the big ones, are increasingly going to be broad, multidisciplinary themes and not narrow disciplinary
They are
pursuits.
already, yeah.
And now,
That's probably already quite true. And that's really a development of the past, let's say 20 years or so. So we really are growing in that direction, which I think is an excellent thing. And right now, for instance, the Dutch agency that does this, NWO, really has chosen very specifically to pursue these bigger multidisciplinary thematic science, society-driven anxieties, if you will, to define their funding
Challenges,
policy.
yeah.
So who funds science? To some extent, science, the science that is being funded is very different from early 19th and 20th century science.
and if we come back to the start of this conversation, Alexander, you edited and put together a very interesting little booklet after the quarantine,
Yes.
in which scientists from sort of all walks of life, I would say, but from different disciplines, economists and statistics and doctors, reflect on our experience during the COVID. I'm just wondering, all three of you, if we look
Audience.
if we look back at that, like the Boris Johnson, Mark Rutte said, you will base our approach towards this pandemic on scientific insight, and that sounded very wonderful, like we established, and then all sort of things happened, and everybody found out that which scientists, only those scientists or those scientists, and if we look back at that. A lot of people were very disappointed, in how unscientific it was, and others were disappointed in how lenient the politicians were, and they should have been more strict. But if you look back at this very, very good example on how science and power interact, what do the three of you take away from it? And then I'd like to go to the audience. That the real sort of lived example.
Well, I think it's quite complicated, but I'll just pick out one thing which builds on what Alexander said, which I think is possibly the pointer to the future. So as you said, hopefully science projects of the future will be big, broad, multidisciplinary and so on, but I hope they will also involve more citizens as creators and producers, not just as observers. And when the pandemic began in Britain, a project called Zoe, which you might have heard of, mobilized citizens, a citizen science project, to monitor their own symptoms. By the end of the pandemic, 4 million people were doing this, and often this was proving more efficient as a way of monitoring changing variants of COVID than the government's own systems. Now, it seems to me this is a direction of travel. This is, for me, a different kind of politicization of science, where many more people, as a matter of course, as they do already on their fitness apps and so on, are generating data, taking part in research projects, taking part in the scrutiny and learning of knowledge of all kinds. And I think that is part of the answer here. If science becomes embedded in daily life and our own agency, we're more likely to understand it, we're more likely to see it as legitimate. And the government could, in March 2020, have actually endorsed this Zoe project and said, we want everyone to be uploading their symptoms. And that would have been a really smart thing to have done. And I hope will happen next time there's a pandemic.
Because there would be much more buy-in and much more scientific data.
Well, we had one like here with the OVG. We had also an app here.
Yeah, the OVG in Amsterdam. Amsterdam did something like that.
Yeah, we had an app like that. Yeah. Well, I think what really lacked is the multidisciplinary approach. So my PhD, who's here, Pina Safkatli, does research on pandemic in Zuidoost, Amsterdam Zuidoost, and the government, the GGD Public Health, had no idea about the coping mechanisms of people.
She does research into the effect or into the...
She looks at the rhythms of COVID. So our research is about that. If you look at the rhythms of people, you don't have to lock everybody up. You can work with those rhythms to make a better life possible. There she is.
We will ask her back. That is an important...
Yeah, very good. Very nice to do that.
Yeah.
Yes, very good idea.
So
it was interesting to find that. So there was no culture in the team. There was no design. There was no social sciences apart from behavioral adaptation, which is a control mechanism, which is not about using people's experiences. And it's fantastical to see, for example, in the community center, they said, we're not gonna let our children be locked up. We will just stay open because the damage that will otherwise happen will be too much. Again, under the radar, people, a lot of things went wrong, but also some things went really right. And the locality is not, we don't know how to bring the knowledge of the people back to the power, or the knowledge of the people back to the science.
Or institutions. Or,
And also then the local government in Amsterdam, they don't accept design as a really fundamental skill you need. If you say, I don't design, you just do bad design. You know, even a letter you write to your citizens is a design.
It means you do bad design.
Yeah. So if you don't take it serious as a national thing, you just do bad design, which they did. They locked us all up. That's bad design.
Very concisely put. Alexander?
Worth remembering. My two suggestions would be, first of all, to me, the whole image, I think, of government policy over COVID is strongly dictated by Mr. Van Dissel, our COVID tsar.
Yeah, Van Dissel, the
And
Dutch Fauci.
good luck to him. Terrible job. I hope he does well. But I think we have learned the hard way that to focus this too strongly on medical sciences alone, health sciences alone, restricts the perspective by far too much. So I very much sympathize with your idea of multidisciplinary science. And my understanding is that we are now preparing the country for the next epidemic or pandemic by basically creating an infrastructure that caters to the various sciences, including the social sciences as well, which I think is probably going to work much better if, God help us all, it ever returns. Secondly, another lesson that we learned is you have to allow for local flexibility.
Yeah.
There was far too much a tendency to impose a national standard that had to work throughout the nation. And I've heard many, many stories of especially mayors of smaller cities who had sort of were wringing their hands because there were things that they could do locally that would have worked much better and would have been much more effective in basically addressing the needs of their population, their specific composition and fears, but were simply unable to do so because the national rules wouldn't allow them to. So if we ever go through this again, let's decentralize properly, accept the fact that there will be variation across the nation. Who cares, as long as most people are at the end of the day reasonably happy.
Interesting round. I wish we could hear this on television, but okay, your insights in that. Thank you very much for this moment. I'm looking towards the audience, to my back as well. If there's anybody who'd like to join in the conversation, have a question. Ga jij, Karen? Ja, dat is een erg goed idee. But not everybody at the same time. But there's a question over here, the lady over here. Yeah. Our editor will hold it for you.
Thank you for the fantastic discussion. Really thought-provoking. I was wondering, well, one of the conclusions was the science should be embedded in our daily lives. The problem is, as you said already beforehand, is that the general public does not like ambiguity, does not like complexity. I see that university students, I teach at a university in the UK, and my students hate complexity. They want everything really simple, black and white, and that is a problem. So how do we deal with that? And again, we have to be multidisciplinary, but just tonight I was sharing with my colleagues that English linguistics department has just closed down in Kent. In the UK, the government is closing down humanities. They don't want people to have different views, different thoughts, and engage in multidisciplinary research. So, universities are not the towers of free thought anymore, at least in the UK. They behave like corporate institutions. And many of my colleagues share that view of, the financial pressures on them. So you can't just do the research you want to do.
You're way too optimistic, Geoff, that there's 1/3 of the population who's happy with complexity.
No, but I think it's a very important remark that you make. I mean, I love science, otherwise I wouldn't be a scientist. I think it's fantastic. And why am I sometimes quite radical about it? Because it's terrible to see how we sometimes educate for obedience and not for free thinking. That academic freedom is not experienced by our students. It's like cookie factories. They have to get the right amount of cookies and then they get a degree. It's shocking. But we are also... I used to work with a really nice board chair who said, we do mass individualization. I thought, mass individualization. It's quite something. There are many students, so also on the admin side, on the orchestration side, it's not easy. But that means we have to trust in different ways, and that we have to do truth in different ways. So I think it requires a rethinking about maybe not a new institution, but change the institution, create more trust in there. There is so little trust. That's very shocking. It's something. And I think anonymity, I mean, I don't dare to say it out loud yet, but the anonymity in the review process, like the anonymity on the internet, creates really bad behavior. No responsibility for your deeds. And I think the anonymity in the review process of academia is getting to the point where it's not okay anymore. So, to be a witness, science started out to be in public space. I am witness to you, and then you. So that's why we can agree on what we disagree and agree on. And the whole idea of being witness to each other's truth, creating truth, experiments. I can redo what you do, validate, falsify, which is essential being witness to each other. We have taken out. And I'm not sure that that was the right decision. I would love to. You don't write about that, actually. What do you think about that? I thought it's a very big thing, that this anonymity in the process creates a different witnessing.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely on the internet long thought the liberal principles of anonymity were problematic in many fields, but that's another issue. Can I just make, as a proposition, actually, I don't disagree with anything you said about British universities, but I think it relates to localization. I think if you're distant from any phenomenon, it's quite easy to want simplicity and black and white and certainty. Anything you're close to, that makes no sense at all. You know, if it's the dynamics of your own household or family, you know it's complex and ambiguous and subtle. And this is where I think bringing science from being just a thing out there which you read about to something which is more embedded in daily life, real-life experiments, gathering data, and so on. I think that is part of the antidote to the phenomena you're seeing. Yeah. Pets is a really good example.
Pets?
As you may know, there are some large-scale citizen science projects.
Dogs and cats?
Exactly, dogs and cats and birds and so on, which people love. It's very low status, but but once you do those, again, you quickly. Again, it's obvious that there's not it's not straightforward, standardized, black and white. And similarly, as I say, it's why I'm so keen on local projects on water or air and things like that. That's how we educate a public, perhaps to be more at ease with the realities of ambiguity and complexity and uncertainty. But at the moment, I've got children who've just been through secondary education and so on. They've never done anything like that. Never. Mm-hmm.
You should take them to NEMO, the Dutch Children's Museum for Science.
Right.
Even at that age.
Yeah.
That is another great way to do it,
right.
actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's a question behind you. Two questions.
Yes, you can, and then after that.
Who was first?
No, the lady, and then.
Okay, I can relax. Okay. I would like to ask a question about your book, but I'll ask it after saying some critical thinking. When I saw the chart which said science, bureaucracy, and politicians, I immediately thought, where is what's behind all this? It's the financial world. Because all these three things are moved, the whole world is moved by money. And you said, okay, the central banks are now transparent, but the whole financial world of money laundering is not transparent at all. And if we only think about the pharmaceutical world, for example, and the lobby they have in the political and in the scientific world, I could give examples, but maybe that would be too much extension. So the question is there a chapter in your book about lobby?
Well, I do talk about money. And the reason I showed a diagram of this attempt to map global science and R&D and the SDGs, and that was an attempt to follow the money, to ask where are we actually spending hard cash, and does it align with the things we think are important? In the health world, which you mentioned, and this is notorious, there are huge imbalances of spending between pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical, physical health and mental health, the diseases of the rich north, the diseases of the poor south, and so on. I could go on. We document those in detail. There's always been a massive skew against environmental, behavioral, mental health in health spending. And that all actually is in the book, and is where certain kinds of corporate power and often capture of the state come in. So in the case of the UK, and this manifested itself in the pandemic, our science advisory mechanisms have always been captured by the biomedical establishment, essentially, often coming out of pharma. Our chief scientist was from GSK, but it's a long, long tradition. They're very eminent, very wise, intelligent people, but it means they see the world in a certain way. And so when COVID hit, as you were saying, mental health was much lower priority. The care system hardly had any voice at all. They did quite well in helping vaccines be developed and so on, but the system was deeply distorted. And much more generally, again, in this Strings report, we document the imbalances in energy, in agriculture, and all sorts of fields when you really follow the money. But the amazing thing was, maybe it's not amazing, maybe this reinforces your point, it was really hard to get that data. We think, we live in a world of loads of data and transparency. Tracking where the money goes on different areas of science and technology is really, really hard. And it's become actually harder in the last 5 or 10 years as corporate spending has become more secretive, as geopolitical competition has intensified. And this makes it quite hard to have a democratic conversation about science priorities because we lack the basic facts, even to start that conversation.
The gentleman over here, and there was a lady over there as well. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much to all the panelists for the very thought-provoking conversation. You mentioned the need for having multiple perspectives and a multidisciplinary approach, and there are projects that have started that are going in that direction. But I'm working at a sustainability consultancy that focuses on systems thinking, and I really agree, and that resonates with me a lot, that we need to have a very different, non-siloed approach to knowledge building. But I also grew up with a scientist as a dad who spent his whole life specializing in one very specific type of protein. And when we moved back to Egypt during the Egyptian revolution and we were surrounded by people that had so many perspectives about where the government should go and what we should do, my dad, who's one of the smartest people I knew, wouldn't make any comments about what he thought because he'd spent so much time becoming an expert in this one area that he felt he couldn't actually make any big statements about anything outside of that specific area. And I also see that when other scientists try to make systems thinking style approaches to knowledge building, they're called out and ostracized by the whole scientific community as pop scientists that are oversimplifying and denigrating the real work that's being done in academic institutions. So how do you create a more generalized approach to knowledge building within individuals rather than at the project level?
Nice question.
So, someone who's run universities, you can answer that one.
Actually, very good university as well. No.
Frankly, I don't think there is a single simple answer here, except that, of course, diversity and variety is as valuable in a research community as it is everywhere else. And a good system to manage, let's say, a national science effort caters to the needs of both. And I would like to believe that the Dutch system doesn't do so badly, but I'm sure I'm going to be contradicted in a minute. But at least it makes an effort to mix them both. So there is, of course, I think, a genuine and ongoing need for very specialized, if you will, square millimeter scientific work, just digging a deeper and deeper hole. And we should be grateful for the people who do it and reward them properly, because at the bottom of that hole is something we are really interested in that could really help us. But at the same time, I think the current challenge and the current fashion certainly points in the other extreme direction, where we really take huge topics, where we look for huge coalitions, very much the European model of research, to some extent the larger, the better, just managing them as a specialization of its own. And of course, at the end of the day, the societal problems that are most urgent and most visible are the ones that you can only address at that level. So let's make sure we keep both of them alive and kicking. I think that is, Frank, it's not an easy answer, but I think it's the only one that I can give.
Well, locally, what we do is that we look the research question that both the scientist and the civil servant or the neighborhood can relate to. So we spend a lot of time finding research questions that both can relate to in their own way. So one question you can answer it in different kinds of knowledge. And with the specialized knowledge, you see that some of the really specialized institutes, for example, on ecosystems, they have some of the researchers work with the city, and others do the detailed work. So they become, there's also like interfaces in the scientific institute. Some people are very good in talking to the civil servants, others are not at all. But they translate, so there's also a layeredness of specialization. But it's really important for the city that every one of those institutes has 1 or 2 or 3 people who are capable of talking to us. Because then the research questions can be made in such a way that also the specialized people can contribute.
Can I attempt? It's a really good question. I've got 3 little bits of an answer, but they're all inadequate. I mean, at a kind of individual level, I always advocate to people, and it's not a new point, to try and have sort of T-shaped knowledge. I think it is good to have real depth in something, to really, this is why the PhD is actually quite a useful thing to do. And I think it's easier then to have that cross-cutting T if there's one thing you really know deeply. And being too generalist, I think, is a problem. Secondly, I think you need what I sometimes call requisite humility. So there's an excessive humility where the scientist says, well, of course I can't say anything about something beyond my specialism, which was too humble, because it means lots of other people are saying things who don't know it either. But there's the opposite problem, which we've seen in AI in the last 10 years, which is AI scientists believing that they could say something intelligent about AI governance. And I've yet to hear a single AI scientist say anything intelligent about AI governance because they hadn't bothered to do a bit of learning to educate themselves so they could say something useful. We've had and I write about these strings of declarations, empty, windy things. They're still happening. And social media is full of AI scientists commenting on governance in, to my mind, absolutely unimpressive ways where they don't have enough.
Geoff, how do you like the European efforts to regulate artificial intelligence?
How long have we got?
Yeah, it's a long story.
Give us a 2-minute answer.
Yeah. I promise we get back to you.
Yeah.
But you can...
1 minute.
So I think it's an okay starting point, the EU Act.
Agree.
It's better than it not being there, but I have this theory of the 1,000 cell. It's just the beginning of a much more complex process. Sure. And I'm glad it's there. It should have happened 10 years ago in my view. And then just the 10 seconds in answer to you is I think it's really important to learn synthesis skills. They're not obvious. Multidisciplinarity is fine, but unless there's an integrative synthetic capacity, which is a specialist skill, maybe that's what you were saying as well, it's just a cacophony. It's just lots of voices. And my university doesn't teach synthesis at all. Which is remarkable. We have lots of multidisciplinary teams and projects, but it's then treated completely amateurishly, that task of integration and synthesis.
It is very hard. I was part of the creation of a new degree, bedrijfskunde, which was explicitly designed to do precisely that.
Right, yeah.
And the argument being, a company is such a big, complex thing. The only way you can properly understand it is through all these disciplinary approaches. So let's set it up in such a way that not only do the students master all these disciplines, but properly integrate it in their heads. And this turns out to be extremely hard. It's already pretty hard to teach all these disciplines. And at the end of the day, the disciplines still rule a large part of the academic world.
I'm going to go to the last question of the evening, which is the lady over here.
Try to be quick. Yeah, does it work? Yeah, thank you very much for everything. I'm very curious about these interface institutions that you are proposing. And I was wondering who would run them. There's going to be a scientist? Is it going to be a politician? Because I understand and I am very happy about this dialogue that is open now between how scientists we need to engage, and Professor Alexander said how do we have to engage? And then you also said something about advocating for ourselves, because if we are scientists, we know that we have something to say about what is truth. We cannot just say that what we are saying or what we see with facts is just another opinion. But how is this dialogue going to be fostered in these institutions? I'm going to read more in your book, but it was just, I was curious to see if you had a quick answer about that.
Who has the power?
I mean, it's slightly linked to the last question. I mean, I think, again, it is, as Alexander said, this is difficult. There's no easy answers. But I think we will need these hybrid institutions, which are cross-cutting interface institutions, as Caroline said, and they will need at their heads hybrid people who are multilingual, who can speak science, who can speak politics, who can speak bureaucracy, who can probably speak business and other things. And within their staff, they can have much more specialist people who don't have to be anything like as cross-cutting. And that's why I would love to hear more about the degree you just described. We need more explicit cultivation of that kind of integrative capability, and to be able to judge what is good, what is bad, what is competence in that capacity. And that's I mentioned this study I did on governments about a year and a half ago on their ability to organize intelligence through the pandemic. It was, to me, really striking how few could articulate a method, a skill, almost an assurance mechanism for that capacity, and yet that's almost the single most important thing a government has to do all the time, is synthesize and make decisions out of all of that complexity. And in the British system, it was kind of implicitly assumed that this would all happen in Boris Johnson's brain. There would be amazingly high-quality scientific advice, inputs, and so on, and then somehow he was meant to magically synthesize it. And that's just a ridiculous approach. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to close, and I'm going to thank you all three very, very much for being here. And of course, thanking the audience, thanking our technicians, thanking Carlijn Saris for organizing, being the editor about this evening. Wonderful. Yes, I mean, it's wonderful to talk to you. It's wonderful to have a conversation on, on knowledge and actually remember that, everything we do in society actually needs to be coming from knowledge and how to organize that process and where it influences power or where power is more important than. And that's from the very abstract, from Hobbes to the very practical, the fact that, yes, of course, an AI specialist doesn't necessarily know anything about the regulations on AI. And we have seen, on social media for the past years, virologists telling us what to do with society, which is another problem. So thank you very much for speaking out and thinking out loud. Thank you very much for being here. Hope to see you soon again.